My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, those of you here in the NLM's Lister Hill Auditorium, and those of you watching remotely, and also following on Twitter using the hashtag NLMHistTalk. My colleagues and I are thrilled that you can hear our first lecture of the year in the NLM's History of Medicine lecture series. This series is an annual program to promote awareness and use of NLM's historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the world. And also the series is intended to appreciate the individuals of various disciplines who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. Before I introduce today's lecture and our speaker, I'd like to invite you to mark your calendars and attend our next event on Thursday, April 4th at 2 o'clock that day here in Lister Hill Auditorium and also via live stream. We're going to be convening Viral Networks Reconnected, a digital humanities history of medicine research forum. This special program will reunite 3 scholars who participated in the January 2018 Viral Networks Advanced Workshop in the Digital Humanities and Medical History. That was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities through a grant to Virginia Tech and hosted by the National Library of Medicine. The April 4th program will also celebrate the open access publication of the proceedings of that January workshop just over a year ago, published recently by Virginia Tech Publishing. Viral Networks Reconnected on April 4th. Chris Phillips of Carnegie Mellon University, Andrew Reese of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Sarah Runcie of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette will together share the progress of their data-focused research and their thoughts about the future of the digital humanities and history of medicine. This forum will also be co-sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Office of Digital Humanities, as part of the partnership between the NLM and the NEH to collaborate on research, education, and career initiatives. Additionally, as I mentioned, like today's program and all of our events, it will be live streamed globally and subsequently archived by NIH videocasting. All of this is made possible for the greater good by a generous gift to the NLM by the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation, and we are grateful indeed. Today's event is a special one because it helps us to celebrate the launch of Medicine on Screen, Films and Essays from NLM, a new website which expands the NLM's engagement with researchers who use the medium of film and video to study the human condition. And particularly, they use NLM's world-renowned collection of medical films and videos, which span over a century, number nearly 40,000 titles total, and include among them an estimated 8,000 catalog titles deemed to be historically significant. Many of these titles are rare or unique, with NLM sometimes holding the only surviving copy. More than mere windows onto health and disease, these collections are important artifacts of times and places in which their creators produced them for a variety of audiences. And documentary filmmakers have long appreciated learning about and using this unique collection to illuminate complex issues in society and culture, not only addressing medical themes, but also exploring diverse subjects from politics to race to class. These films reflect a range of human fears and hopes conveyed through distinct cinematic techniques and the perspectives and agendas of their filmmakers. So with this background then, it's my distinct privilege to introduce today's speaker who knows far more about these collections than I do, and who has very kindly and very generously shared his expertise with the world as a contributor to our new Medicine on Screen project, and in multiple presentations over the past year with our colleague Sarah Eilers, who oversees the collection here at the NLM. These presentations have highlighted the work, the collections of the library, and they've included presentations at the Orphan Film Symposium in New York City and the Northeast Historic Film Annual Summer Meeting. Dr. Oliver Gaykin is Associate Professor of English in the University of Maryland's Department of English and Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. Dr. Gaykin is a historian of cinema and media with an emphasis on the intersection of science and medicine. He received his BA in English from Princeton University and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He previously taught at York University and Toronto and Temple University. His teaching interests include silent-era cinema history, the history of popular science, and links between scientific and experimental cinema. His book, entitled Devices of Curiosity, Early Cinema and Popular Science, appeared with Oxford University Press in the spring of 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gaycken and thanking him for his time with us today and in appreciating his fantastic voyages through the historical audiovisual collections here at the National Library of Medicine. Dr. Gaycken. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, Jeff. I'm very pleased to be here today. And your remarks anticipate my own introduction today because I wanted to begin by noting that today's lecture coincides very nearly with the relaunch of the website, featuring essays on audiovisual media from the library's collections. And the relaunch site, Medicine on Screen, here's an image of the splash page, but I also want to pause and acknowledge what went before, the first version of the website that was entitled Medical Movies on the Web, which was due to the efforts of Mike Sappel, Paul Thierman, and David Cantor. I'm very grateful to have been asked to continue this wonderful project by Sarah Cantor, the library's historical audiovisuals program manager, and I also want to thank Beth Mullen and her team for the excellent website redesign. I want to move on to this image, which helps contextualize the work that's gone into the website and the work that is still to come. There are currently over 20 essays on the site, but as you can see, this represents only a tiny fraction of the number of films that have been digitized, and that body is itself only a tiny fraction of the films that have been cataloged. And at the base of this image, you see the 30% of uncatalogued titles. Who knows what surprises lurk in that mass? So there's obviously a tremendous amount of material remaining to draw on, many more stories to be told. Indeed, the National Library of Medicine's extraordinary collection of audiovisual materials attests to the presence of a largely unknown history of the 20th century, where medical media educated and persuaded untold millions of patients and doctors and documented diseases, innovations, and procedures. Today, I'll present 3 case studies that give an indication of the range of the National Library of Medicine's collections. A voyage through the history of human anatomy with Frank Armitage, Disney animator and medical illustrator. A sampling of global family planning films by Virginia-based Airlie Productions, which made films for the United States Agency for International Development, among other entities. And a series of training films for medical students about sexual dysfunction. Together, these films demonstrate a variety of approaches to communicating medical knowledge and the enduring value of the medical profession's audiovisual records. My first example is a short film that at first presented something of a mystery. Lacking a title or credits, we do know at least that it was made by Frank Armitage, whose voice you will hear in a moment. And from that bit of information, a more complete story can be told. Armitage came to the US from Australia via some time in Mexico in the late 1940s, where he worked as a muralist under Diego Rivera, among others. He then found work as a background and layout artist at the Walt Disney Corporation. While working at Disney, he took classes in medical illustration at UCLA and went on to provide images for a wide range of educational and industrial films in the latter half of the 20th century, ranging from Man and the Moon, a 1955 episode of the Disneyland television show, and the image on the left, you can see Armitage on the right. Fill Her Up, a promotional film from 1959 about gasoline for the DuPont Corporation. Steps Towards Maturity and Health, a 1969 sex ed film produced by Disney for the Upjohn Pharmaceutical Company, and many, many more. The image on the right here is Armitage using a multi-plane drawing device for a special spread that he illustrated for Life magazine in the early 1970s. Here then is the beginning of this short film that was most likely a filmed version of a presentation, probably for the Association of Medical Illustrators in the late 1960s or early 1970s.
I like to feel that there can be great beauty in medical art, a beauty that really goes hand in hand with science, as we explore the infinite inner spaces of the human body. Here we move deeper through the spectacular caverns of the heart, and we feel like explorers in this fantastic anatomical world.
The essay about this film, which I co-wrote with Ethan Parnas, at the time a University of Maryland undergraduate, currently in his third year of medical school at George Washington University, is now available on the redesigned website. So I won't go into more details here, but this clip can serve as an emblem for the talk in a number of ways. First, its mention of how images can provide a feeling of exploration in a fantastical anatomical world invokes Armitage's celebrated involvement in the visualizations for the Fox Richard Fleischer film Fantastic Voyage that I also allude to in the title of this talk. Furthermore, Armitage's evocative commentary helps to make a more general point about the functions of medical media, namely their ability to provide virtual experiences, and how the medium of film can multiply the experiences to which individuals can be exposed. Any archive or library harbors this potential for fantastic voyages of the imagination. And then finally, I appreciate that this opening image is a trip through the heart. Not only is February, as it happens, American Heart Month, but this image also helps underscore the importance of caring and, yes, loving medical media, which, like all historical artifacts, are vulnerable to many things, but most crucially to indifference. I'll now turn to selections from a collection of global public health films collected at Johns Hopkins University and given to the National Library of Medicine in the early 2000s. These films address concerns about overpopulation, family planning, sanitation, nutrition, poverty, and the environment in developing nations. On the one hand, the films respond to fears of global overpopulation that flourished in the late 1960s and that can be represented by Paul Ehrlich's Neo-Malthusian The Population Bomb from 1968. The other end of the period, which I won't address today, was marked by the emergence of a new batch of global pandemics, most prominently HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. Overall, these films are part of the story of how globalization and public health media developed in tandem over the course of the latter half of the 20th century. Indeed, they are excellent examples of one of globalization's most prominent slogans: think globally, act locally. So I have two examples from the collection, and the first is from a technical educational film entitled Technique of Laparoscopy from 1979.
Prior to the insertion of the laparoscope, the fallope rings are loaded on the instrument. This should be done no longer than 30 minutes prior to application. To avoid ring damage, the loading instruments, rather than fingers, should be used. Any damaged ring should be discarded. The miniature light source has been connected and is in working order. The laparoscope is slowly inserted through the trocar, and visualization of the peritoneal cavity is carried out. The nurse assists the surgeon by positioning the vaginal instruments. To apply a ring, the forceps are extended. Only the fallopian tube is grasped at a point 3 or 4 centimeters from the cornual end of the uterus. The ring is applied slowly, without creating tension on the tube. When properly applied, about a 2-centimeter knuckle of ischemic tube is visualized. The applicator is now switched to allow placement of the second ring. At completion, the adnexal structures are inspected for bleeding. The laparoscope is removed gently.
A couple of things to note about this film. One is that it can serve as a representative example of a vast number of films in the collection, films that taught practitioners how to do a technique, so surgery films and so on. More specifically, what's interesting about this film and about this sequence is, on the one hand, the all-female surgical crew. And then, in terms of technique, you'll note in the credits, you have, on the one hand, the credit for the doctor in Thailand, but then you have a separate credit for the intraperitoneal photography. And so what we've just seen in this sequence is an example of what in film studies for intro to film I would point out is the Kuleshov effect, the ability to create a synthetic space using editing. So the image of the procedure happening in Thailand is intercut with the intraperitoneal photography done in DC, probably much later or maybe earlier, but it scans as a sort of real-time experience. Of course, it also bears emphasizing that film is only a part, and often only a minor part, of a larger media ensemble mobilized by these campaigns. Consider this sequence from Communicating Family Planning, Speak, They Are Listening, from 1974. This film was targeted at media decision makers in various countries, and it's a veritable primer in global communications strategy. So it begins with traditional media, the printed word, newspapers, and then also the radio. Moving on to comic books and a feature film based on the comic books, television, and visual aids, the large flip chart and the handheld graphic being used in the hospital setting. Indeed, this campaign leveraged some of the oldest media, such as the Postal Service and shadow puppet theater, as this clip demonstrates.
A woman
who has just had a baby receives a letter from the Ministry of Health congratulating her and suggesting gently that she might consider postponing for a while the birth of her next child. Even a woman who cannot read usually has a friend who can, and she is glad to have the letter and listen to its message. Receiving it, she has gained a certain dignity. Her neighbors will talk about it. She and her new son have become two important people. It is almost axiomatic that postpartum women are in a frame of mind to receive suggestions about spacing or limiting their childbearing. Since so many women still bear babies at home, direct mail is an effective way to reach even illiterates living far from communication centers. The idea of adding family planning messages to the ancient shadow puppet shows of Indonesia must have seemed almost sacrilege at first. And yet, the minor comic characters have been used to deliver topical and political messages, couched in gossipy humor, for centuries. Accordingly, puppet masters are being trained to add information about family planning to the sketches which serve as comedy relief in the traditional dramas. Almost any culture will give an imaginative communicator some such means for bringing a message in palatable form to the people who need it most.
So I think, as you can see from these clips, emerging a kind of dynamic or a tension that I see throughout this collection, which is on the one hand, kind of a heavy-handed Western intervention in the lives of people from different cultural backgrounds, but on the other hand, kind of a global feminist intervention to provide women with control over a central feature of their lives, their reproductive health. Taken together, these films illustrate the shrinking world of globalism, with the U.S. as a hegemonic source for knowledge. But despite the film's tendency to present a kind of view from nowhere in the form of health precepts delivered by an unseen authority, we can locate them within the regional context of the DC metro area's non-theatrical media industry. Not only were the films part of a distribution service, the Media Materials Clearinghouse of Johns Hopkins University's Population Communication Services, but many of the titles were also produced by local organizations, including prominently Airlie Productions, which was associated with George Washington University. Dr. Murdoch Head was Airlie's, and here's the Hopkins link as well. Dr. Murdoch Head was the founder of Airlie and began his career in broadcasting in the 1950s, hosting ABC affiliate station WMAL's Your Decision, a regular one-hour live public affairs program. Here's an image from a later period when he was with NBC, when his show was with NBC. And this background drove Head to form a division of his foundation that would make a significant contribution to documentary history. Airlie Productions eventually comprised a complete film studio with a staff of writers, directors, producers, and 4 camera crews. More than 250 Airlie production programs were produced in 72 countries and earned over 50 international film festival awards. And here's a quick montage of some of the opening credit sequences. The film served to disseminate the goals of the Airlie Center, pictured here, which Life magazine dubbed a, quote, island of thought. So one dimension of this space for reflection that I'd like to highlight is how it allowed for the inclusion of otherwise excluded perspectives, notably those of women. Miriam Bucher was the screenwriter for Speak They Are Listening, and then this is a credit for a family planning film in Indonesia. She started her career in cinema as an assistant to the famous documentarian Par Lorenz, and she and her husband, Jules, worked in documentary and government filmmaking for several decades. And I'll just briefly say that her example, I think, demonstrates how medical films provided a venue for a woman's voice to be heard on the critical issue of reproductive health. And I think you can hear it pretty clearly in the conclusion to Speak They Are Listening.
A young wife need not die worn out by childbirth. An illiterate farmer can believe in the possibility of educating his children. A child can grow up in a household in which there is room for love. A woman can come to know more of life than childbearing, drudgery, the threat of early death. They are waiting to know. Speak. They are listening.
So I'm going to turn now to my third and most extensive example. The medical profession has long enlisted the moving image as an aid in the treatment of a wide range of sexual dysfunctions, from the anti-VD films that constituted an early and persistent subgenre to social hygiene films about dating do's and don'ts and beyond. I will focus on a group of training films for physicians and psychologists providing counseling for sexual dysfunction. Targeted at medical school students, they're primarily concerned with how to conduct effective counseling sessions, but they also register the aftermath and ongoing repercussions of what has come to be called the sexual revolution in the U.S. The first 3 films I'll talk about today are from the Aspects of Sexual Interviewing series, which was part of the Sexuality in the Medical School curriculum. These teaching materials were created through a collaboration by the Center for the Study of Sex Education in Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Medicine, and Ortho Pharmaceutical Corporation's Department of Educational Services. Ortho, a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, had been making contraceptives since the 1930s when it marketed a spermicidal jelly. It was the second U.S. manufacturer to come to market with an oral contraceptive, and was thus part of the major increase in women's control over the outcomes of their sexual activity. The final organization involved in these productions was Northwest Mobile Television, an early, this is another pill image here. The final organization was Northwest Mobile Television, an early video production service, and the films credit a videotape editor, although they were distributed only on 16 millimeter as far as I'm aware. And I'm going to return to this issue of film versus video in a moment. Penn's Center for the Study of Sex Education in Medicine, which no longer exists, was founded by Dr. Harold I. Leaf, a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who trained as a psychoanalyst at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. Leaf was a pioneer in integrating sex education into the medical school curriculum, and he provides the film's presiding presence. The interviewer in the films is David Reed, a younger colleague of Leaf's who followed him to Penn from Leaf's previous position at Tulane. These films all employ a similar form, presenting an interview that is followed by a, quote, replay analysis of key moments presented with voiceover commentary. Leaf introduces the films and reappears at the beginning of the replay analysis portion, as well as supplying the voiceover commentary for the analysis section. The films model the dual forms of labor in the encounter. On the one hand, the interviewer's work at observation and intervention that channels, on the other hand, the couple's work in maintaining a healthy relationship, their labors of love, as it were. So let's look at the introduction of the, quote, frigid wife from 1972, the first of a two-film set and the earliest of the Ortho productions I'll talk about today. I'll turn it over to Dr. Leaf for the introduction.
This is one of a series of films dealing with sex and marital counseling. The goal of these programs is to increase your powers of observation and counseling skills. We are about to observe an initial sex counseling session with a young wife. The problem presented by Mrs. Martin is frequently encountered by physicians and counselors. As we do in each of these films, following the interview, we will have a replay analysis of interview tactics and interaction dynamics.
Leaf, who had come to Penn in 1967, was credited with placing an emphasis on making the training of doctors in the realm of sex education more scientific, an aim that the stripped-down aesthetic provided by Northwest Mobile TV subtly supports. The other prominent feature of the mise-en-scène, aside from Leaf's pipe, is the television set, which, given the series' 16mm format, seems somewhat incongruous. But the TV is there not only as an indicator of the production context, but also because of the film's emphasis on analysis. The use of the phrase replay analysis recalls the origins of mobile video trucks as an outgrowth of news and especially live sports reporting. Indeed, instant replay enters the American lexicon just prior to the period of these films via the early mainstream visibility of the techniques of slow motion and freeze frame in TV sports broadcasting. And one of Leaf's obituaries notes his love of Philly sports teams. But replay analysis is also a then contemporary word for an old educational technique, that of guided recapitulation, which, as Leaf puts it, serves to, quote, increase your powers of observation. I will return to this notion of the use of film to train perception in a moment. But first, let me continue where I left off with the beginning of Linda Martin's interview, where we see Dr. Reed at work for the first time and where Mrs. Martin explains her problem.
Mrs. Martin, is that right?
That's correct.
And your first name is?
Linda.
May I call you Linda?
Oh, yes, of course.
All right. How old are you, Linda?
I'm 26.
Mm-hmm. And you're married to... Your
Bob.
husband's first name is
Bob. Roberts, but I call him Bob.
Okay. How long have you been married?
4 years.
And do you have some children?
Yes, we have two girls.
Okay. What does Bob do?
He's a lawyer.
I see. Fine. Well, now, Linda, tell me, how did you happen to come to see me? What's the difficulty facing you?
Well, it's, I guess the problem is sexual.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see our minister of our local church, and he suggested I get some professional help because I don't quite know what to do about it.
How did you feel coming in today to talk about it? How do you feel being here?
Well, I feel like it's really a necessity, and I really want to get help, and I really want to find out what's causing these problems, but I have to admit I'm a little nervous, I guess.
Okay. Well, try and tell me, for starters, if you can, what is the current dilemma? What's going on that troubles you?
Well, I'm afraid that I might be frigid. You know, I just don't seem to be able to respond the same way I used to.
I see.
I'm sorry.
Well, now, when did you first notice this? Tell me the story about it.
Well, I don't know. It didn't happen all at once. It, you know, it happened over time.
And what brings it to your attention now?
Well, quite frankly, I've just had it. We're fighting a lot now. We're not talking. We don't seem to be able to get to the root of the problem, and I'm frightened.
This opening sets the scene for the analysis to come, establishing the notion of frigidity as Mrs. Martin's central concern. But, as the quotation marks in the film's title signal, this diagnosis is not accepted at face value. And as Mrs. Martin makes clear, it's a label that has been placed on her by her husband. Near the conclusion of the interview, Dr. Reed resolves this aspect of the problem by encouraging Mrs. Martin to dispense with the notion that the sexual dysfunction in her relationship is something for which she alone bears responsibility.
In initiating a therapeutic response, education is used to build the patient's self-esteem and to give her a sense that the doctor is able to help.
Well, where did you get the impression you were frigid? How did you happen to use that label?
Well, from reading, and then I know in one of our arguments, Bob said I was frigid, and he said, all my friends think you're so attractive and so sexy, but you're not really.
But you have had climaxes. You are
Yes.
orgastic, and you have been in the past in better settings. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Well, that doesn't qualify you for being frigid.
Well, it's been a long time, though.
It's okay.
You can't become frigid?
No, you really can't. Not if you've been orgastic. It's a bad term, okay? So leave it in quotes, take it off wherever you're wearing it and give it to someone else, all right?
As you can see from Leaf's helpful chart, this moment of reassurance and education is part of a structured experience that he outlines before the analytic recapitulation. I now want to consider some of the other features of this section of the film, how the filmmakers have worked to create pedagogical experiences. In other words, they envision the task of training the interviewer's perception. The first example is the honing of a venerable psychoanalytic form of insight, the slip or parapraxis.
After you got into the marriage routine, you had your children pretty quick.
Yeah.
Well, right away, I guess.
Yes, the first child was born about 9 months, a year later.
Okay.
Interaction between patient and doctor usually provides useful cues in the appraisal. The obvious slip of the tongue, which you just heard, indicates the probability that conception occurred before her marriage. This may be highly significant. The interviewer has a choice between challenging the patient and letting the slip pass without remark. What are the implications for each choice?
So included in this scene is another way that the film trains perception, which is with recourse to an extra cinematic device. Leaf's question, what are the implications for each choice, indicates the presence of a booklet that was produced to accompany the film. I have not yet been able to locate a copy of this booklet, but we can glean from the prompt embedded in the film that the booklet contained space for reflection and probably constituted a testing mechanism to see whether viewers had retained crucial insights. This interface with a testing regime also prompts us to reflect on the question of the genealogies for these films. So in addition to the aforementioned tradition of cinema as a tool for public health campaigns, the ortho films are also allied with more specific subgenres. Two that come to mind are training films and also films that have an interface with an external testing apparatus, so for instance, driver education films, and also specifically a whole genre of therapy films. This emphasis on focusing on overlooked details, the slips of the tongue and body language, also recalls the tradition of microanalysis, as exemplified by Ray Birdwhistell, and it's been the subject of some recent work within cinema studies. So what happens then when Linda brings her husband along to a conjoint session, as requested by Dr. Reed? We find out in Anatomy of a Sex History, The Wife's Husband, the sequel to The Frigid Wife. The situation begins in a predictably tense and unpromising way.
Pardon. I appreciate your coming in. As you know, I saw Linda last week. May I call you Bob, incidentally?
Certainly.
Tell me how you felt about coming in. I want very much to meet you and get your perspective, but did you have any reactions to her asking you to see me?
Irritation.
Tell me about that. What do you mean?
Well, I had to reshuffle an entire week's schedule. I'm afraid I'm very busy in the office.
You're a lawyer.
That's right.
Right.
And it required quite a bit of redoing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm questioning the importance of my being here at all.
So you have some personal irritation besides the professional?
Oh, yes, of course. I'm as I said, I'm very busy, and this is Linda's problem, basically, and I don't understand what value my being here can be. I don't think I can contribute anything that's significant, except to probably restate what Linda's already said.
Let me tell you my findings. I feel that Linda's suffering from some emotional blocks about her sexual performance. She felt she was frigid, which is a bad word. She's not. She simply doesn't have orgasm during intercourse. That means that you're involved. And I would like very much to have your perspective on the situation in order to be able to have you help her through me. Would this be a possibility?
Well, I suppose it is.
All right. Tell me, if you can, something about your analysis of the situation. How do you see it?
Well, of course, I'm somewhat subjective about it,
Sure.
but her sexual performance is diminished. She doesn't seem to be enjoying it. Consequently, my enjoyment is a little less. She's snappy around the house, a little quick to anger.
And you don't know why this is...
No, I don't.
But it's been about 2 months, and as far as you can tell.
That's
All
right.
Tell me, if you can, something then along these lines. We'll get back to the cause of all this. Something about yourself. Where do you come from, and what kind of a sexual upbringing have you had?
I suppose I'm an average middle-class American. My parents went to church regularly. They didn't discuss sex much. I don't think they had any particular...
Over the course of the film, Dr. Reed chips away at Bob's resistance, a process that then culminates in a rather remarkable instance of consciousness raising, where Dr. Reed picks up on Bob's avowed normal American sexual upbringing as a significant part of the problem. The following scene takes place after Dr. Reed has recommended a self-conscious return to foreplay as a part of a course of therapy.
Do you understand? You look a little puzzled, Bob. Do you understand?
Yeah,
Is it worth a try?
I suppose so. It just seems like a very artificial kind of setup.
No, I would like to try it, because that's what I missed about. Remember, before we began to have sex, we did a lot of
Well, that's true, certainly.
holding hands and silly things, but I miss that.
It's called foreplay. A lot of people make it forework, which is too bad. Now, let me explain his dilemma. He's an ordinary American male who was brought up in a casual atmosphere about sex and really hasn't had very close, long-standing, intimate relationships with women. And also, he is conditioned as a sexual animal to really be more concerned about his genital sensations than anything else. We're like that. We don't have the same kind of skin hunger that the Lindas of the world have for a total caressing experience. Our bodies aren't used to that. I really bring this up because I think that the women are right, that their desires for a more generalized sexual experience are probably a little healthier than just you and I, who get a genital sensation, get aroused, and want to get to it, down to the nitty-gritty, and stop all this messing around. That's what you call artificial. I'd like to suggest that we do this because it's going to be rather like learning a new sport. Okay? At first artificial, but then you'll slip into it naturally.
As you may have noticed, Linda got a haircut, which becomes a subject of conversation at the outset of the session. And I want to return to that moment because I think it indicates how this process has become for her, has endowed her with a newfound sense of self-determination.
Linda, Bob and I have just been talking in the same way that you and I talked as to how we've used the situation and what might be done to correct things as they've developed. I want to know something about your feelings, for starters, in terms of being out there in the waiting room. Incidentally, I see you got your haircut since you were here last.
Yes, do you like it?
Yeah.
I felt like I needed a change of some kind. I don't think Bob likes it.
I like it.
You like long hair. You know you do.
It looks fine. It looks fine.
Well, anyway, I like...
He didn't believe you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Overall, this specific interview provides an insight into the so-called sexual revolution, and in particular, how the changing mores of the era affected older and more conventional couples. As a final glimpse of the Ortho-Leaf-Reed collaboration, I'd like to perform a small bit of microanalysis myself, drawing on a scene from a third film, The Impotent Husband. Here, the onus of the sexual dysfunction is shifted to the man, and the resolution of the issue hews to the same contours as established in the frigid wife, the wife's husband duo, namely that the issue is not physiological, but rather a deterioration of the spousal bond.
That we make an agreement that between now and the next time you come, next week, no intercourse. Just by agreement, no matter how excited or romantic or concerned you get, no intercourse. Because he's got to be kept away from having to go through something that he's anxious about. And the both of you need to get back to fun. It sounds to me as though you got a sex life that's either a routine or it's on the edge of work.
Mm.
Can you recall when you were courting or petting and all that? Not too far back in the Dark Ages, was it?
Seems like the Stone Age now.
Can you
It's a
recall?
long time ago. Yes, I think
Was
so.
it fun?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you recall the
It's
fun
all
you had
right.
with
Yeah,
that?
sure. It was, yeah, it was
And no intercourse was at stake, at least at the beginning, I presume?
no,
Right?
No.
not in those days.
So no strings were attached.
Mhm.
Nobody had to perform.
The detail that interests me here is when the husband says in passing, "not in those days." So putting together a few clues in the interview about when these petting sessions would have taken place, we can place this couple's initial courtship in the mid-1950s. The husband's wistfulness registers the sense of an accelerated sexual present, the pressure of a generalized increase in sexual expectations against the older inability or unwillingness to talk about sex in detail, or with recourse to admission of interpersonal vulnerability. These films demonstrate the potential for confusion and harm that the sexual revolution both exposed and made more amenable to improvement. Liberalized attitudes toward love were not just for the young, and they were not simply a matter of a revolutionary change in perspective. Rather, they would have to be worked through and toward. The final film I want to share with you today is entitled Bill and Sue, a co-therapy team approach to conjoint sex counseling from 1973. Also produced by Ortho, this film features different therapists at work, Beryl and Noam Chernick, the team from the title whose approach to sex counseling involves a high degree, as you'll see, of self-reflexivity.
Charlie. Okay. Might catch that drape again, Al, right down the bottom.
Okay.
Earl,
Never mind.
no. Will you take your places for the opening, please?
Not forget the appointment book. Have a good show.
Thanks, Bob.
Say, I feel anxious.
Tell me about it.
Well, we're making a film, and I'm not an actor.
Well, we're not expected to be actors. We're just supposed to do what we do.
Yeah, that's what makes me anxious. You see, we do sex counseling, and that involves talking about sex.
Yes?
And,
I thought men talked about sex all the time.
well, yeah, they brag about it, and they tell dirty jokes. But they don't really talk about sexual feelings.
But they know all about sex.
Where do you think they learn?
Weren't they born knowing?
Not any more than any other kind of human being.
Oh. Well, if they don't know, why can't they ask?
Well, see, a guy can't ask because he's expected to know, right? And if he asks, then it means he doesn't know, so he doesn't ask.
I see. Well, that's an awful bind to be in. I can see where that would make you uptight, not wanting to talk about sex.
You know, I got another problem.
Well, you better tell me about that one, too.
Well, I'm a physician. You know, people go to their doctor and expect them to know all about sex. Say, how are the people watching going to know we're doctors? I mean, are we supposed to introduce ourselves?
I don't know.
Then how do the people know that we're doctors?
Don't worry about it, no. We'll just burn it in.
They're going to burn it in.
What does that mean?
I haven't the faintest idea. That's some kind of professional jargon.
We're ready to start.
Ortho Pharmaceutical Corporation presents Bill and Sue, Scene 1, Take 1, a co-therapy team approach to conjoint sex counseling.
We're rolling. Okay, Burl. No. Go ahead. Don't be nervous.
So this self-awareness is not just a gag to lighten the mood, because it's mobilized in the service of highlighting the medical profession's own blind spot with regard to sex education. You'll note an echo of Noam's performance of the male bind from the introduction at the conclusion of the following scene, which begins with a device-bearing interruption that prompts a direct address summary of the case at hand.
Oh,
Hey, no.
what now?
This film is only so long, we can't go into all the details.
Well, okay, we'll summarize. During their courtship, Sue and Bill decided that they would save sexual intercourse until after marriage, so they did everything but, including petting to orgasm. The problem began on the wedding night when an early attempt at intercourse provoked pain in Sue, and Bill became frightened and backed off. The rest of the 2-week honeymoon was a disaster. They continued on their planned motor trip, but when they retired to the motel room, they renewed attempts at intercourse the first 2 or 3 days. After Bill encountered Sue's repeated distress, any further attempt at intercourse was prevented by his loss of erection. This then became the focus of their fear and concern. They avoided discussing sex and eventually even stopped having any physical contact.
Sue, can you tell us what you consider the problem to be? Well, I mean, when I married him, I thought he was a man and knew about things. Now I find he doesn't know anything.
I feel threatened.
Tell me about it.
Well, it's this expectation that I'd know all about sex.
You mean men weren't born knowing?
That's right.
Oh, but I expected that my husband would be in charge of that area. So you were pretty disappointed, Sue. But it wasn't a realistic expectation.
By playing both themselves as counselors as well as patients, the Cherniks literalize the therapist's tools of mirroring and modeling, a dynamic that takes on a particularly adorable quality in this final scene from the film that I'll share now.
Session is the 4th session with the Williams.
Right.
And they've reported real progress.
And Sue's found great pleasure in her ability to stimulate Bill. Isn't that right, Sue? That's right. I never thought it would happen. But I like seeing him, react.
No kidding. I've always enjoyed watching Sue, but I didn't know you liked it too.
Well, you really turned me on.
Jeez. How about that? It's important to tell your partner when you're pleased and when you're not pleased. Isn't that right, Burl?
Well, I'm real pleased with you right now, Noam. You said that very well.
Well, thanks very much.
So here's hoping that we can all take a lesson from these love doctors about the importance of mutual acknowledgement and apply it to the context of creating a two-way street between archives and their patrons. Indeed, I hope that this presentation today, whose aim has been to share a sliver of the National Library of Medicine's rich collections, might entice you to work on these materials yourself and to pass along the word to friends and colleagues. Thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, for questions. And if you have a question, please just raise your hand. And in front of the microphones, you have a button to turn your microphone on, which will then illuminate it. And so I'll be able to see who is speaking. So any questions at this point are welcome. Yeah.
The microphone. Hi, my name is Cecilia, and I enjoyed seeing these images from the archives. And my question is about the films you showed in the middle, especially the one that takes place in Mexico and in Indonesia. What do you see as the audience those films were made for? Because I felt like they kind of had this similar eugenics feel that of like non-white people that was happening during that time, and kind of like, were those ideas being given to doctors or to people who were going abroad and providing family planning care to non-white people? Can you talk about that more?
Sure. The films were made for a variety of audiences. So the film about laparoscopy was made for practitioners who would be performing the procedure. The other film that I showed the excerpts from was made for a kind of managerial class or an administrative class. And yeah, you're right. I mean, there are overtones in it that have a kind of worrying quality to them. Although, I mean, this is still, in a lot of ways, I think, one of the preeminent ideas about how to deal with population questions is to give people control over reproductive, their own reproductive health. So there is a kind of an uneasy quality to some of the films, at least to how some of the dynamics are being stated. And that's certainly historically one of the dimensions that's crucial to both acknowledge, but I think part of the tendency might be to see them as, sort of helplessly stuck in a mode that is different from the current moment. And I have a tendency to see them more as films that are in dialogue with right now, so that there are elements of them that are troubling or have become troubling with time. And there are other elements that have remained sort of enduringly helpful, kind of in terms of their response to problems that, persist. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gaycken. I really enjoyed the presentation. I want to go back to the same set of films in Indonesia and Thailand and Mexico. Looking at it from the presentist perspective, obviously, there are a lot of problems with those films. One of the first things that struck me is that that for the film Speak, They're Listening, the they in that, I think, is the women who they're trying to provide some sense of control over their reproductive life. But the narration and everything is very, very male. And I'm wondering at what point, today I would hope that a production like that would not be made, that, if they're speaking to women, maybe there would be women narrating and things like that. But at what point did criticisms of that sort start to come into play? So when this film was made, obviously that would have been, that nobody questioned it, or at least nobody involved in the production questioned it. But were there criticisms made about, well, maybe we shouldn't have the old white guy talking to the Indonesian women about their reproductive rights?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that will have to be answered by a dive into the archive surrounding the film. My suspicion is that there are records of both production, which might have traces of this, and of its circulation. And that's where I would look to see, what were the discussions during the production? Did this issue come up? If so, how was it addressed? I mean, I will say that this Speak film was one that was written by a woman. Miriam Bucher is the credited screenwriter for it. And so even though it's a male voice, at least in that one concluding clip, I think you have a kind of a indication of a not strictly kind of paternal, patriarchal perspective on it, which of course, again, from today's perspective, might not be as sharp or as refined as we could expect. But the answer to the question of its reception is one that I would love to have, and hopefully will, someone, either myself or someone else watching today who comes in contact with these films who wants to work on this, it's an open thing to dive into. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you very much. This was fascinating, and Fantastic Voyage was actually one of my favorite movies when I was a kid. So thanks for bringing that up. I'm curious, what is the state of metadata about this content? So do we find that the films kind of stand for themselves, or when you say that they're cataloged, is there metadata that can be studied and acted on, or is that still kind of a work in progress?
Well, this is a question for the archivist, maybe.
There, can you hear me? All right. There is metadata. It's not as thorough as we might like it to be. We typically know when something was made. The credits show us who made it. If we're lucky, we get the additional information about who wrote it or who narrated it. But we have a lot of films that are actually missing that kind of information, where the cataloger needs to supply a title, or we're guessing at a date based on other things that arrived in that same donation or that same collection, or even looking at cars or dress or whatever it might be. And then we have other sort of defining things where we try to identify the genre and the country where it's taking place and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't call it the richest, but some of the catalog films have quite a bit, and others, we have a lot of mysteries in the archive as well. Sometimes we even get things where the first few frames have fallen off from repeated showings and wear, and you just don't necessarily have a way to reconstruct it unless you can find someplace else that has a copy and see if they can provide you that information. And the other thing I wanted to say, going back to the distribution of these Airlie films, is that they were considered, in some of the literature that I've seen, this is, quote, direct to the people. So they were distributed either free or at a very reduced charge to nonprofits that were trying to give women reproductive choice, and they were to be shown, in villages and communities, tote along the projector, show it, have whatever sort of help you might need, nurses, midwives, female counselors that could speak to the female population. Because in other films, we have hundreds of these. You'll see that actually only women are doing the talking, both the narration and the interaction, because it was not acceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable for a man to go to a woman's home and speak to her about this in a number of cultures. So you actually see a wide variety. You don't see only the white male narrator and the very paternalistic tone. You do see it a lot, but it's not indicative of all of them.
Thanks for elaborating on that.
Sure.
And I'll also just say that about metadata, one of the things that I've become increasingly convinced about related to medical film and other science film is that they operate in often a very different environment from entertainment products. So entertainment films are really engineered to be largely self-sufficient, self-contained. And that's less the case with these sorts of training films, educational films, so that it is, I think, the norm for them to be circulated with accompanying materials, ranging from something as minimal as like a sticker on the inside of the film can that gives you, some talking points for discussion, to much more elaborately produced booklets, and then sort of sometimes entirely other kinds of media that go along with the film, models, and other forms of kind of supplementation. So one of the tricks or one of the potential hazards of dealing with films like this is to think about them as analogs, thinking of them as analogous to the kind of media that we're most familiar with, which is entertainment media. But in fact, these things often functioned in a different way. And so the challenge is not to just think of the film, but to think of the entire program and how it was set up and administered. Yep. So I see we're a little bit past our allotted hour. Maybe if there's another question or two. Anything from Twitter? Oh, well. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.